If I have a black female surgeon, my first assumption will be this person had to meet lower standards because the school or the certifying board was so anxious to say we have a black female surgeon. And of course, it's unfair to the individual, but then the whole system is unfair. So should you be shocked that it produces unfair results? No. I mean, it's unfair.
It is unfair, down on the face of it and in practice and every other possible way.
Yes.
So it's a lot to unpack here. So as many of you know, I don't shy away from tough topics. I did when I started social media that I was here to serve, right? And so I serve in several ways. I serve by talking about the Lord, my love for Jesus. I talk about plastic surgery, staying safe. I educate. But also I realize there is a community on here watching who are young girls and guys who look like me coming up in the surgery world and who are seeing this online and seeing one type of response. And there's some things I don't see people saying. And so that's why I said, it's important for me to come out here and just encourage. I could write a book on this topic. But the first thing I want to say is this, and this is for anyone watching, especially those who, let's say you're like, I want to be a plastic surgeon, I want to be a surgeon or something, and you see this all going online and you're like, oh my gosh, and suddenly that imposter response, right? We call it imposter syndrome, but I call it imposter response because imposter syndrome is a response to what you experience and the bias you experience and stuff, and suddenly you start questioning, do I belong? Is there a place for me here? And I describe here often how I went through that. So first thing I want to say is this. Not everybody feels this way, okay? So you have to understand that many times the viral things you see going on, the popular things you see going on, does not represent everybody's response. There are many people who feel the opposite. There are many people who know how hard it was and how much harder it is because of the biases that you face in general, or that I'll just speak for myself, the biases I faced and things I faced as I came up in the world saying, I'm going to be a plastic surgeon, right? And I say this to give you an example. The very first time someone looked at me, and I tell you I needed to hear this, and said, Amaka, do you realize what an advantage you have being a black woman and being a plastic surgeon? Up until then, I had seen it as a disadvantage because when you come up in the world as being a black female plastic surgeon, I got an afro, all this stuff, and you don't see many people who are like you in the field, you question your place. You question if it's a disadvantage. But the very first person who told me that was a white man. So podcast, I went back and just watched the whole thing because I feel like it's important to understand the context in which things happen so that you can speak on it in a manner that is productive. I'm a plastic surgeon right now. I have my own practice. I see patients of all colors who come from out of state. Many times people seek me out because of the fact of who I am. I had a woman, this was about 4 years ago, I first started practice. This was a woman who came in and she said, I sought you out because you're a black female plastic surgeon and I understand what you had to go through and overcome. And so I know that I'm in good hands. You cannot see this rhetoric and think that everybody thinks like this. And sometimes when you see something going viral like this, that's what you get. And that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing that is important to say, we all have to understand that the concept of implicit bias. What does that mean? It means someone walks into a room and whether it be their size, their color, their gender, their hair, what they're wearing, things that are in their control and out of control, you form a set of judgments and assumptions. That's the reality. This gentleman is just being open and honest about it, but the reality is that happens, right? I'm not going to sit here and act like my journey has been smooth sailing and all this stuff. I mean, I am where I am now, and I'm very grateful for my practices. I worked hard. Certain biases existed. And how did I know that? Well, the first time I learned that was, I'll give this brief story about when I was going to apply to medical school. And the reason I knew this is I had it in the back of my mind is because I have an aunt who is an electrophysiologist, cardiologist, and she told the story of when she walked into a room and a patient, and she was an EP physician by then, and a patient asked her about the tray, about what they were having for dinner. And I just, that was at the back of my mind. I kind of pushed it back. A very prominent medical school interview. At that point, I went to college. Obviously, I was at LSU. I had never made a B. I made all A's. I was just very driven. And my dad taught me early on, like, Amaka, I see you wanting to do big things. Remember, you have to excel above and beyond because you can't do anything questionable. Those were his words. Like, nothing you can do can be questionable. You have to excel. And he taught me not to dwell on certain things, and he just taught me to work hard and let my work, let my work ethic, everything just speak for me. That's what he said. Amazing guy, miss him every day. Okay, but I went to medical school interview, and I was sitting in front of this gentleman, and he looked at me and he was bewildered. He said, "I don't get this. I am so confused." And I asked him, "What do you mean?" And he described that you're from New Orleans, you're a black woman. How come you're here? Like, you have all done all these things, you've excelled in school, and how come you didn't end up on the street pregnant or doing drugs? Now, I'm not making up this story, that's a true story. And I sat there confused. That whole day, the whole thing was a blur. I got into the medical school, but the whole day was a blur. I never told my parents that story. It took me years and years to even share that. I held that deep, deep, deep inside. It took me probably a decade before I shared that. And I didn't tell them because I just didn't want them to be crushed, right? And I felt like I could handle it. But what I realized is that it just kind of built and built. Um, and there was bias there, right? Because when you think you got grapes, you got a group. Let's say you buy green grapes and you go home and you see one grape is red. So you're going to be like, does that grape belong there? Like, is it a grape? Because it doesn't look like the other grapes, right? You're going to question things, right? So that grape kind of has to prove itself to you. Hopefully, like, tastes better than the other grapes. So you're like, oh, that's a grape, and that was a good grape. But another example I have. This was several years. This was a couple years, actually. I think last year. I was going into the lounge at one of the hospitals for lunch. It was a physician's lounge. And a woman stopped me and said, "Oh, no, I'm sorry, this is just for physicians." I had a white coat on. I had my hat on that says Dr. Maka. And I stopped her and said, "I'm actually a physician." And she looked shocked. She was a black woman. Okay, so what am I saying? Bias exists, y'all. The big thing you gotta do, recognize you have the bias. Denying the bias is not going to help anybody and not help you, not help people. Recognize you have the bias and ask yourself, how can I check this bias at the door, right? Now, yes, the reality is I faced a lot of bias in things. You might call it racism, some people might call it bias. Whatever it was, I faced it, and these were gut punches that are all held in. Part of it is you don't want to admit it's real, but you hold it in, and you somehow just find yourself pushing through, going through life, and always feeling like you have to be above the bar because the bar's already set here, right? That's kind of just the reality. And when as my children grow up, I'm going to teach them the same thing. And unfortunately, it is what they're going to face and it's what we face. And you just have to have yourself, how am I going to get through that, right? Know you belong. Know there's a place for you. Like, you are who God says you are. At the end of the day, that's kind of what I held deep into my heart as I went through all these things. You are who God says you are. And now I'm in a place, I'm in my own practice. Patients seek me out. And, when I walk into the room, I would say my reputation precedes me in a sense. But I've worked really hard for that, but it's it's not always the situation that you walk into that's contentious and all this stuff, right? It can be different, but I'm not going to lie and say I didn't work extra, extra hard for that. Hold this like anger or resentment for what I've gone through or who I am, etc. Because again, I'm a believer, and I believe that God works everything for our good. I went through all these things, and a lot of that is all the inspiration and motivation I share on here. If I hadn't been through all that, maybe I wouldn't have much to motivate people with and really help people along their journeys. We hear what have been going around, right? And I want to say this. This is not a political post. This is not. This is the human experience that I needed to comment on. We have been hearing a lot about this rhetoric in the medical community. Okay, like, is my doctor going to be credentialed, or because of DEI, did they lower the standards? I want to explain the importance of different measures and things, right? Because I talked to you just now about bias, right? And what bias is and what it does. Like, someone walks in the room and you make these assumptions. Well, that happens in medicine. It happens at medical student interviews, happens at residency interviews, happens at fellowship interviews, just reality. So what has happened is everybody has to take a step back and realize, okay, am I judging everybody based on their merit alone, and is my bias gone? That's an important conversation to have, because the merit is the same, the grades are the same, the extracurriculars are the same, the leadership is the same. But when they rank them, usually the applicant of color falls low. And the only thing that is different is their race. You got to be aware of those biases. The reality is that in medicine, you can't lower standards, etc., because at the end of the day, we all take the same certifying boards. We take step one, step two, you got to pass your boards, you're taking care of patients. Like, so there is a standard that is held. And I just wanted to kind of say that, so that you know that a lot of what you're hearing is simply just not the reality. All right, y'all. I hope that helps. Again, I could probably talk for days and days about this, and part of it is just condensing it to something that makes sense, but also I hope it gives some bit of information to each person watching. All right, y'all. Nothing but love. I'll catch y'all later.